and between 70,000 years ago and 40,000 years ago, walked to every continent of the planet. Can you imagine that? So that by 40,000 years ago, there were our ancestors, Homo sapiens sapiens, on every continent of the planet, including Australia, North America, Indonesia. They had, so there was a great diaspora, in other words. So we can think of the African exodus and the global diaspora as this moment of differentiation, which indeed was accompanied by an explosion of creation of new languages, of cultural identities, of physiognomic types, amazing variety of appearance, of language and so on, all of the same species, all of the human family, but increasing differentiation. Thousands and thousands of languages, of course, hardly any of which, compared to what had come into existence from that time, survive now, unfortunately. I don't know, I can't remember now the total of existing languages, but there's a great die-off, as you know. Just as we're in the middle of a mass extinction of species, we're in the middle of a mass extinction of cultures and languages. Right?
Just a quick question. There are few controversial...
Can you speak up? Sorry, I can't hear.
A few controversial theories about human
origins.
Origin says that there are two origins of human Homo sapiens.
Yeah, there's a multifocal origin theory, but it's...
Does it have anything with your story, with your narration of like...
It just doesn't. It seems that there's growing consensus, based on genetic studies and so on, and so that all human ancestors, that our species, originated in Africa. The consensus is that there were several waves of exodus. The first one around 70,000 years ago, and then another later wave. The first one would have been would have led to Homo sapiens sapiens going into the Eurasian continent and into the Fertile Crescent. Then you would have had a second wave that would have gotten our ancestors into Old Europe. And then from there, and anyway, so there's different waves, but they all came from, that's a consensus now. There are differences of opinion. So we have diaspora. So we have human origins, we have diaspora, and then beginning around 1500, so 500 years ago, beginning of the modern period, with the circumnavigation of the planet, we have the establishment and the increasingly stable and accelerating intercommunication of humans on all continents. Right? So that movement of diaspora, which had dominated, starts to be counteracted by this, what Teilhard describes as a folding back in on itself of the human presence on the planet. Now, of course, this process did begin earlier in many ways, but it begins in a qualitatively new way 500 years ago with the literal circumnavigation of the planet and the establishment of ongoing communication and exchange between humans on all continents of the planet. So this is the beginning of the planetary era 500 years ago. It's the beginning of the modern, and it's also the beginning of the planetary era 500 years ago. Even though the full implications of that planetary era don't really dawn on most people until the 20th century. Right? And Teilhard de Chardin, of course, after the Second World War, writing right out during and after the Second World War, becomes perhaps its most inspired and focused prophet. So really seeing into this phenomenon of planetization, because it was really obvious to him right after the Second World War, and it's increasingly obvious to us now, of course, with globalization and the internet and global financial crisis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it was not so obvious to people, except for geniuses like Teilhard de Chardin, even 50 years ago. Even though in retrospect, we now see that it began 500 years ago.
So it sounds like there are two meanings or context for this term planetization, when it actually began and when it then dawned as a shared conscious perception.
That's right.
So who's in charge of the term? Has anybody, so no, you can't use it for that, you have to use it for this, or does it have both meanings?
Has both meanings. I mean, I get planetary era from Morin, but it's also, I mean, if not that term, the idea is recognized by McNeill and I can't remember his name now. These world historians, and Korotayev, you know, other Russian world history sort of thinkers. They recognize that this something significantly different began at about this time. So it's a generally recognized phenomenon, but we just don't think of it in those terms. Okay? So this is one way of seeing that, well, over the last 200,000 years, this code, as it were, starts to give us a sense of the structure of that arc. And it also lets us know that the middle phase is actually not temporally in the middle, right? Because we have 200,000 years, and then it's only within the last 500 years. So if you were to plot that line, it would go like this. Right? And that curve, that asymptotic curve, which within which you have an acceleration of processes that are related to this fact that Teilhard pointed out, that the Earth is a finite sphere, and that once the human presence has covered it, our activity folds back on itself, and you get a necessary acceleration of the process toward some kind of mutation. Right? So this is true in many of these processes. Even though there are three phases, they're not of equal length. And the transition between 2 and 3 is of a particular nature. It's a mutation. The transition from 1 to 2 is not a mutation. It's an organic development. From 2 to 3, it is a mutation. It's a phase shift. It's a quantum leap. And it's also associated with a death and a rebirth. So the death-rebirth happens between the second and the third phase of the structure.